So Linda, let me know when you want me to start.
Good morning or afternoon, as the case may be. This is the VAPALS ELCAP OSEHRA Working Group call for Wednesday, April 24th, 2019. And I think we're going to have some cool stuff for those who are interested in this kind of stuff. Matt is going to show us the new intake forms. Well, the form is not much different, but the forms and notes. So, Matt, go ahead.
Okay, good morning or afternoon, everybody. Um, I thought I would start by showing this slide that was given to us by Ricardo about the intake form. So the intake form is the form that the navigator uses to determine the patient eligibility for the program. And then also it continues to whether or not the patient actually wants to enroll or not. And it's really divided into three sections, and so it's very flexible in the way that it can be used and the timing of its use as well. So the first step, though, is always about chart eligibility, whether or not a person qualifies for the program. And that's the first section of the intake form, which I'll be showing. And then the second section is what they call the pre-enrollment discussion, which may or may not happen depending on if the patient is willing to go right into the intake portion, the third portion, which is also the enrollment portion. And so there's a couple of different tracks that you can go if you're a navigator to reach the bottom of the form. And you can have up to 3 different notes that end up in the chart, depending on how this form is used. You could do just the chart eligibility, and then later do the pre-enrollment discussion, and then later do the intake, and that would result in 3 notes. Or you could do the whole thing all at once, like you see over here on these F and G tracks, and that would result in just 1 note with basically all 3 sections in it. So that's the overview. Let's go ahead and look at what it actually looks like. Let's see. I'm going to bring this up. Here we go. So I've already logged into Avicenna, which is the particular demo database that I'm going to use for this. And I found out that we haven't been using the Z patients, so there's a whole bunch of them I can use. And I'll just start with the first one and go ahead and bring this patient into the system. And this takes you right to the enrollment form whenever you enroll a patient. And that makes sense because that's the first thing you have to do is determine their eligibility and whether or not they actually want to participate in the program. So as I noted before, there's really 3 sections. The eligibility section, then one section that's kind of hidden here is if you say yes here, then it asks about the pre-enrollment discussion held, and you can say yes or no on that. If you say yes, it opens the second section. And then the third section is this intake discussion. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show different ways this can be used. So the first thing is I could just get a call about a patient or a referral about a patient. Maybe for today I got it, and maybe it came from a primary care provider. and they say, you know, this person might be good for the program. So I look this patient up and do a chart review. And based on the chart review, I say, yes, this patient is, in fact, eligible for our program. But the patient's not here, so I'm just going to submit this. And when I hit the submit button, anytime you hit a submit button on this form, you basically make a note. And so now the note has been generated, and it takes me right to the note. You can see it here, and it's got a name. In this case, because it was just an eligibility note, it's called a chart eligibility note. Now, if I go to the case review page right here by clicking up there on the upper right-hand side, you can see that I've got a note written here called eligibility note, and it's got the time and date. And I also can go back to the intake form, which I could do later today, or I could do in a week or whatever. And when I go back to that form, I come back to this section here about whether or not there's a pre-enrollment discussion held. So you can imagine I can get this patient on the phone and I can say, hey, do you want to come in and get enrolled for this program? So let's say we're going to have a pre-enrollment discussion. We've got a default date. I did it by telephone, and it resulted in that they're interested. And so we're going to proceed with the enrollment process, and maybe I'll say something like the patient will come in tomorrow. Again, if I hit a submit button, it means I'm going to make a form, or I'm sorry, I'm going to make a note. So this is the second note that can be generated, and it has a different name. This is called the pre-enrollment discussion note. And it's also got different content, basically saying, yeah, we contacted them by telephone and they are interested in discussing. So we can go back to the case review and see what happens when we generate the third note. You'll notice now there's two notes here, and I'm going to hit the intake form again. Now this time, you'll see that this, we don't have any options here. This has been done. So it basically says, hey, this has been done. And now we're just at the third part of the intake form, which is called the intake discussion, which I often call the enrollment section because that's what we're doing. And there's a date. You can change the date if you need to. Maybe the patients come in now. You need to verify their primary address, and this is being brought back from the VISTA database and should automatically tell us if it's urban or rural, which are stats that we're interested in keeping. But if it's wrong, we can change that. So can override what the computer says right there based on what the patient says. And let's say that we'd have a smoker that's current, and maybe they're smoking 20 a day, and they've been doing it for 15 years, so that's 15 pack years. And they decided they were going to quit today. What the heck? Why not? So now we have given them some education. If they have diagnosis and any prior CT scans, they would go there. And this part's really important. It's you won't get paid if you don't fill this out. And what you're saying here is that you've had this discussion, and it's a program that you both decided on together after discussion. And based on this information, let's say that the veteran has decided to enroll in the program, and we're going to go ahead and do a low-dose CT scan on this patient, which is what the screening program is all about. And the clinical indication is he's a smoker for 15 pack years, right? So once we put all that in there and he's now in the active status, we can hit submit. And this should write the third note, which will have a little bit more substance to it, as you can see, and also a different name. And if we go back to the case review screen, we will see that now we have 1, 2, 3 notes with the date and time associated with them. Now you can go back to the intake note and you can make other changes as necessary to the third part of that form. Once at this point, you can make some changes if you need to, like if the patient decided to disenroll or became ineligible for some reason, you could record it there. Now, what I'm going to do now is show you another way to use this, and we'll have to enroll a different patient into the program, or register, I should say, a different patient. We're using the words register to bring them into the program initially and enroll when they decide they actually want to participate. So again, this could be a self-referred. They walked in, we looked at their chart, they said yes. This time, since they're standing in front of us, we could go ahead and hold the discussion. And this was in person. So again, you don't have to make a note there. You can just blow right through that, and they're interested in doing this. So they're in the waiting room now, and they're going to talk to somebody about enrolling, but something's come up and patient had to leave. And will return. So in this case, we only got through 2/3 of the form, and we had to submit this because the patient intended to go through the whole thing but didn't quite make it. So at this point, now you can see that we've got both the eligibility and the pre-enrollment discussion note done. And that's what it will show here on the name. And then later when they do come back, I can open up the same intake form. And at this point, you can see that it's smart enough to know that's been done, and we go right to the intake discussion. And we'll say, again, it's in person, that we verified the address, which is right there, and another urban, and we're assuming that these people smoked, otherwise they probably wouldn't have been referred or self-referred, right? So, any good navigator is always going to say yes to that question. And we'll enroll this one for 20-pack years. Actually, 1-pack years active. So this is the track where we end up with 2 complete notes instead of 3. And again, later you can modify part of it if you want. And now I'm going to do the last one and then hand this back to Linda. The last, when I say the last one, I mean the last part of this particular demonstration. And in this one, we'll just go ahead and do all 3 parts in one note. One nice thing about the way this is done is it's actually very easy to navigate through, and it does get the details that you need. So you can skip the pre-enrollment discussion if they go right to enrollment, and that I imagine would happen a fair amount of times. Um, so another urban. We're blowing our stats here. We like rural, but of course, when you're just playing the odds, more people live in the urban areas, so naturally you're going to have more urban. And active enrollments, submits. And in this case here, we have just one node generated. And in this case, when it's just one node, it's called the intake node. And there it is. Now you can also do a single node by doing all three of those groups at the same time, but it's pretty much what I've been showing. So at this point, I think we should be just open for questions about that form.
Well, it sounds like everybody liked your presentation, Matt. I don't see anybody clicking in to ask questions, but if you guys think of any later, please do let us know. Larry, are you ready to show some unit test stuff?
Sure.
So Larry's going to show us a little bit about, so our goal for OSERA certification is to have unit test coverage of more than 90% of our code. And we've had that for a long time, but then, darn it, developers keep changing the routines, and they do things like change variable names, which is something that is not a break, but the unit tests have to be changed to take that into account. So Larry's going to show us a little bit about what he's been working on.
So, Linda, I have on my screen share, and it shows my screen, but I can't push the share button.
Okay. Let's
Maybe Rick can help.
Just click on the screen, the actual visual part of the screen, and that will allow you to do it.
There we go. Yep.
Oh. Okay. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just assumed that button was there so you'd push it, but thank you very much.
You'd think.
So this takes a minute, so I'm going to start this right now. We have a routine. There we go. We have a routine that runs through all of our unit tests to cover all of the routines that are driving VAPALS. And while this is running, it'll go through and tell you there's a few things to say. One is Linda's correct. We're working on the unit tests basically all the time during development because routines keep changing. HTMLs that are generated keeps changing. And so these unit tests don't look just to see whether an HTML was generated, but they actually check to see if the HTML page is designed as it should be, as it was before. And so there's three things, at least three, that you look at here when you're running unit tests. And one is, of course, is the hope of maintaining coverage of over 90% or more. And that's what percentage of the lines of code. So if all of these routines together had 1,000 lines, then you'd want to have at least 900 that were actually checked during the unit testing. The other thing is each test, as you can see coming up here, tests a piece of the routine. And it will say okay or fail depending on whether or not that test failed. If the test failed, you can still get a high coverage. You run through all of the lines of code, but in fact, the test that you were doing failed. And so the hope is to get that correct as well. And then with all of that correct, one would think you're out of the woods. But just recently, again, in fact, it was the urban-rural routine that takes a look at the zip code and translates that into whether you're urban and rural. And that fail that passed by right here on the screen, by the way, is a correct one. There are no active radiology residents in our test system. And so it did fail. It couldn't find any, but it says the reason it failed is there aren't any. Anyway, it turned out that it was returning the wrong result for urban or rural. And I think Ricardo was the one that said, how come your unit test is working when it's returning the wrong answer, which I thought was in particularly bad form. But it points out a very interesting thing. In this specific case, the index on the file that it was checking had been corrupted because of development. It won't happen normally. And it just happened, the two zip codes I chose, even in the corrupted index, came out with an answer that was right. However, the answer to many zip codes was wrong. And so just because you've covered a lot of the lines and just because you get an okay, you really aren't still out of the woods. And so it's very difficult to manage unit tests so that they not only cover a lot of lines, the unit test itself works, but in fact, you're really reporting the honest truth that, yes, this is really working. So in the case of the urban-rural, I changed to looking at a larger number of zip codes and a much broader range of numeric entries. So with constant reworking with every new routine and every change in the HTML that's produced, we're right now still hovering at about 92%, or a little over 5,000 of 5497 lines of code. So anyway, just interesting things to learn. Just because it looks good still doesn't mean that you've tested your code and that it's working. How embarrassing is that? And I think the only way to do that is through the discovery during development, just like Ricardo found. I mean, nothing was breaking, no errors were happening. It was returning urban or rural. It just wasn't correct. So I think, unless there's any questions, that's probably all I have.
So any comments or questions from anybody about the unit test, I guess, function?
Yeah, I just want to take this moment to once again, and I will probably do this every time we display unit tests, to thank Dr. Joel Ivey and Sam Aviel for the stupendous work they have done over the years in generating the M-Unit framework that has made all this possible. It's the practice of generating a rich suite of unit tests to go with all of our software, the practice of distributing it with our software so that it's installed at the site so that users can test for themselves if they think the software is still working anytime they want to. All of this is a revolution in quality and the way that we set about creating stable systems that do what we intend them to do. So kudos to Joel for pushing that boulder up the hill, despite a certain amount of kind of lack of support while he was in the VA. As soon as he left the VA, he got it out there in the world, and now we're all using it. And you're changing the world, man. Thank you.
And then, of course, Sam worked with some of kind of spiffed up different places of the unit test suite, as I understand it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sam made very significant modifications to it, yes. And so Sam did a lot of the work as well.
Yeah, we're in both you guys' debt. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions, either about what we've shown or about the project itself?
I have just one quick question. This is just
Sure.
I'm really happy to see the unit tests and the great amount of work that you guys have done towards putting the coverage result up as high as possible. As I was just looking at your Docker Hub instances, I saw that this was updated 2 days ago. Are the most up-to-date unit tests part of that Docker Hub update?
No, there have been some changes in the unit tests in
This-
the last 24 hours. So they were up to date. So I need to update them again. In fact, one of the errors
Great.
we
All
were
right.
having,
Well,
I
thank you
fixed.
so much for that. Well,
Sure.
I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm just trying to get ahead of the certification work that we have to do once the submission comes in. So exploring the unit tests on my own is something that I like to do. But I think I can probably make do with the ones that are there, and I can wait for the most up-to-date version when we get there.
And I'll update them right away. One of the tests, in fact, I fixed about 15 minutes before the call, so there was no hurry, So I'll get them out in the repo now in just a few minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
I think, if I may interject, this is Alexis. Sure. I think there was a slight miscommunication there. And please pipe up, Joseph, if I am wrong. But I think you were looking at the latest Docker Hub image, which is not the same as the latest state of the code.
Sure, yes. I was looking at the Docker Hub image, which is only 2 days old. So it's a fairly reasonable approximation, but I guess it's not the most up to date.
Right. But I would add that, even 4 days from now, that Docker Hub image will not be outdated. It's just a matter of which one should always do anyway after launching the container, running the update Vista script, and that will bring you up to date within no less than or no fewer than 24 hours of the state of Avicenna. So the Docker Hub images are more of a and I'm saying this for the broader audience. I'm sure that you get a lot of this. The Docker Hub images we publish periodically when there have been sufficient changes to the way that we sort of run things from a sysadmin angle. But even if you're working with a 2-week-old or a 2-month-old Docker Hub container, or Docker container, just run that backup, update Vista script, and you're looking at the latest code.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. I'll make sure to do that.
You bet.
So this is Larry. I have a question, and Alexis may have just answered it, but the unit tests not only depend on the code, it also depends on a graph store where we have files stored for what the HTML should look like. So will that be upgraded correctly as well? Because I've made changes to both the graph store and a couple of the routines.
So yes, the update Vista script updates both. Well, it updates a bunch of stuff, but for the purposes of this conversation, it updates both the code and the state of the database on Avicenna.
Okay.
So yes.
All right. Great.
So it updates them to where Avicenna is or where the repo is, if that makes any sense.
So there's a little bit of a disconnect between the project repo, which is, at GitHub. Oh, and you know what? Now I may well have. Anyway, so there's a bit of a disconnect between what the project repo under the OSEHRA namespace on GitHub and the actual sort of running state of things on Avicenna. And so, in fact, when you run the update script, both the repo, the project repo, which isn't running code, which is stored under home OSEHRA lib silver VAPALS, that's also updated. But more importantly, for testing purposes, the active routines directory, home OSEHRA run routines, and the active copy of the database and all of the graphs that it entails are updated as well. And they are not necessarily brought up to the minute with Avicenna. So Avicenna gets backed up automatically in the middle of the night. Now, any of us with access to Avicenna can at any time run the backup Vista script, which will manually create an instantaneous snapshot of Avicenna. So when you run the update Vista script in a Docker container, you are getting something that is no more than 24 hours old. But if someone has run the backup Vista script in, say, the last hour, you might well get the state of Avicenna 1 hour ago. Does that kind of make sense and answer the questions?
Yeah. Thank you.
So if I've got my Docker instance and I run the backup script, like when I first get in the morning, 8 in the morning, I might only be 8 hours out of date or so.
That's right. Just for the purposes of clarification, and I know you misspoke, you would be running the update.
Sorry. Yes, I misspoke. Thank you.
I know. Yeah. That's just for the recording that I bothered to mention.
I appreciate it.
I do as well.
Thanks, Alexis.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Anybody else have anything they want to ask about? Okay, great. Well, you guys get half an hour back of your day. Please use it wisely. And we'll hopefully talk to you next week.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.